All right, let's keep running through these non-experimental methods of research. As you know, we've made it through a couple of these. Survey research we spent quite a bit of time on before we were forced out of the classroom, and you've just listened to the observational research part yesterday, if you're going by the syllabus schedule. In this video, I'm going to talk about case studies and archival research. They have a lot of things in common, and they both involve using kind of deep dives into different aspects of the research question that you're looking at in a little bit of a different way than experimental studies and a lot of the other ones on this list. So, first, case studies. What do I mean when I talk about case studies? In a lot of ways, case studies are sort of what comes to mind when people might stereotypically think about psychologists, particularly like clinicians and people dealing with mental health disorders, where you have a patient that you have a big description of their history based on some in-depth interviews and things like that. It might involve the clinician having real big breakthroughs with this patient or discovering something really unique about them, sort of the stereotypical way that we think about case studies. And those types of things do obviously happen, and they're portrayed that way very frequently in media and entertainment. But case studies, as a general research endeavor, are a bit broader than that. In their simplest way of describing them, case studies are just very detailed observations of a single person or situation. So if we sort of contrast this with naturalistic observation has to do with, getting into an actual setting and seeing how people are behaving in a very natural way. Case studies are more often going to involve a lot of reflection from the person involved if it's of a single individual. Generally, case studies are going to be used in especially a clinical sense if you're trying to look at a relatively rare or hard to document sort of issue. So, for example, some patients with brain injuries or particular mental health problems might be kind of rare, or at least patients that are willing and able to participate in lots and lots of different interview sessions might be kind of rare. So going into their history might sometimes be very helpful to figure out things about their recovery trajectory or different abilities of theirs that have been affected by the malady or the injury. Case studies are often also seen as kind of a jumping off point in a lot of senses, in kind of an analogous way to naturalistic observation, giving you an idea of what's going on in a particular realistic setting, and systematic observation building off of that and looking at something a little more specifically. Case studies are kind of analogous to naturalistic observation in that they are generally not going to lead you to any definitive conclusions because again, kind of like naturalistic observation, you have very little control over what's going on. You're just making observations about, somebody's life or how a particular situation unfolds. They can be very, very useful in this regard, but beyond that, they don't have tons of usefulness because they, can't be used to look at cause and effect relationships. There's not a lot of systematic comparisons you can make with other people because they are so specific and digging so deep into one individual or situation's details and history. It's also the case that we generally don't let people make claims, or it's kind of an odd way to phrase it, I guess. We generally don't take case studies as evidence for one theory or another. They might show that a theory has some kind of baseline level of viability if it's showing some sort of way of describing the development of an issue in a patient or something like that. But it's not going to be like definitive evidence that makes somebody endorse one theory over another, generally. The biggest issue that precludes that is basically that you can't really compare case studies. They're so detailed and so idiosyncratic and specific. It's not really like an experiment where you can compare effect sizes or compare very specific things about the methodology. Case studies just don't lend themselves to those sorts of comparisons, so they don't let you rule out alternatives either, because there's no kind of causal inference that you can do. Under the rubric of case studies, people might also include things like simpler testimonials and demonstrations. This is just all to say that case studies don't always have to be these in-depth interviews or like summaries of a specific situation. They can be a bit broader than that, but that tends to be a little rare. Usually it's more like looking at a patient or a particular situation. Okay, so all that stuff is a little on the abstract side, obviously, so I think it's useful to talk about a few examples as we go on. And I mentioned at the start of this that people, frequently think of a case study being written by some clinician or psychiatrist who sits in the chair, maybe smoking a pipe and writing down the occasional note while somebody, is like lying on their couch and telling them all sorts of things, or, somebody that is suffering from some particular brain injury and they're stuck in a lab while people study them or something. And these examples come to mind because they are in large part, true examples from the early and middle parts of the last century. They really did do those things, and some of them have been very influential studies. They're not the only kinds of case studies, obviously, but some of them are pretty interesting and maybe worth going over in just a little bit of detail. One of the people that might come to mind for lots of people outside of psychology when they think about case studies and psychiatry and things like that, of course, is Sigmund Freud. So I think it's, useful to take every opportunity you can to point out that although Freud was extremely influential and likely a very intelligent person, he was also, a bit of a weirdo, and kind of an unethical one at that a lot of times. And, it's not to just overly disparage this person who hasn't been around for quite a while, but he also had, by many accounts, like a pretty sizable cocaine addiction. And not to say that you're a bad person for being an addict. Being an addict is a disease, but it also is something to think about when he is, perhaps furiously writing through these different observations he made about people and not always being mindful of the ethics that are involved. So he's a very complicated figure that had an incredible impact on psychology, some of it good, some of it mixed, some of it not so good. And Freud, unsurprisingly, is somebody who, maybe took advantage of the systems that were around when he was practicing in the early 1900s, he began in the late 1800s and through the early 1900s. He used case studies a lot because they gave him a lot of latitude to just say he was right, because they don't really, give you a chance to test the theory. You can just put forth ideas and sort of claim that you did things that were correct. So he has tons and tons of these different case studies that he published. A couple that I just want to mention real quick are ones about a patient that was referred to in his notes as Little Hans, and another that he called the Rat Man. Little Hans was a young boy, started getting treatment around age 3 or 3.5, all the way up through being 5 or 6 years old. And this little boy had lots of kind of, fears that were, honestly very reasonable for a little boy. But his father knew Freud through writing to him and thought that Freud would be interested in trying to help treat his son. So the father actually just wrote all these letters and descriptions to Freud, and Freud wrote back suggestions about treatment, and he believed that the father was competent enough to try to carry out different psychoanalytic treatments with his son on his own. So Freud, by all accounts, never actually met with this little boy. He just kind of, by proxy, sent treatments to the boy's dad. But like a lot of things with Freud, the ideas about what was going on with this kid kind of center around, sexual urges and psychosexual development early on in life. And little Hans, by all accounts, was very fixated on his genitalia, but also worth noting that a lot of little kids are fixated on their genitalia at different parts in their childhood because, it's a interesting part of your body, right? That is frequently covered up. So sometimes you're just interested in it. But this little boy, he called his penis his whittler. So there, in these case studies, there's all these different references to his whittler, and there's other indications that the parents were not maybe necessarily as supportive and sensitive as they might have been with the child, as the mother, at least on one occasion, as the 3.5-year-old child was touching himself, the mother told him that if they kept touching it, that a doctor would come and cut it off. So you can kind of see where maybe this kid is a product of his environment, and things, and the way that he is treated are maybe leading to some of his fears and neuroses. Another big thing that sticks out in these notes are that the father wrote to Freud that the boy was very afraid of horses. Like, they'd go out into the town that they lived in, and the boy would run away from horses or be cripplingly afraid of them. And Freud, as you might know, is a big proponent of these kind of fixations and fears that children, particularly young boys, have with their fathers. Freud says because boys are jealous of their fathers, because little boys are sexually attracted to their mothers, and so then they are jealous of their fathers because their fathers are having sexual intercourse with their mothers. So boys are jealous of that and have a rivalry with their fathers in this way. So Freud's suggestion for why the boy was afraid of the horse was that the horse has a large penis, just like the father seems to the kid. So the horse represents the kid's father, and that's why he's afraid of him. Okay, so pretty weird stuff to assume about a little boy and try to correspond through letters about to get a dad to treat this kid. And this was something that was actually published in 1909 as analysis of a phobia of a 5-year-old boy. One of the things that Freud accomplished in his career was to write up things about this. And he claimed that through his treatments of this boy, he assuaged these different phobias. So obviously, kind of questionable whether he actually had a good outcome on this kid. Probably not necessarily, but it's hard to say because they use pseudonyms in these things. And there are different reports that people seem to know who this kid was, but who knows. The other one that I have here is about the Rat Man, published the same year. This was published under the name Notes Upon a Case of Obsessional Neurosis. And this was a guy that he was an adult at the time, in his 20s, and he got treatment from Freud for about 3 months, kind of sporadically, and then met with him for a few years after that, even less often. And he was somebody who had a lot of different obsessions and compulsions. The diagnosis for obsessive compulsive, either personality disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder, neither of those really existed at the time. Maybe he had one, hard to say, because Freud's notes are kind of crazy, even though they're some of the only notes we have of Freud's for this case. But he had all these different compulsions, some of them sexual, some of them not. He was fixated. Again, Freud said on his father, and one of his compulsions is that he would like open the door to his apartment between midnight and 1 to let his dead father's ghost come in, apparently. And he also was very fixated on masturbation, which he started to do relatively late in life. And he had all these like verbal associations with rats. The German word for rat, ratten. They had all these like verbal associations, some of them rhyming with that pronunciation of the word, and some of them not. But Freud said that this guy had all these unconscious fantasies about, sexual fantasies, some of them having to do with his father, some of them not. And it's kind of left up in the air if the rat man actually ever said any of these things, or if Freud was just basically telling him, hey, you do these bizarre actions in the middle of the night, it seems like you have some unresolved sexual issues with your father. So these are the kinds of things that Freud tends to assume about people, which is interesting. And Freud published these. He claimed he had excellent success with this person in assuaging these phobias, and it was hard to ever follow up with this person and see if that was true or not, because this was published in 1909, and this person was enlisted into the fighting in World War I and died in 1914. Sorry, it might have been 1915. It was within the first year of the war starting, and it started in 1914. So hard to follow up and see if he actually did help this person. But from a case study, he can just kind of claim that he did. Nowadays, case studies are much more, vetted and peer-reviewed. When Freud was doing this stuff, it was kind of the Wild West of writing these things up and claiming that you knew something about the inner workings of people. So, all this to say, why do I go on this giant tangent about Freud? Well, first and foremost, I think there's never a psychology class where it's not worth pointing out that Freud was a real weirdo. And some of the things that he wrote are, interesting to kind of reflect upon how far we've come in psychology since then. Even how influential he was. He had some interesting ideas, we'll say. Some other types of case studies that I alluded to earlier, people having brain injuries. These tend to be a lot more rigorous and a lot more helpful, frankly, in figuring out very particular things about human functioning. So I won't go into tons and tons of details about these, but a couple names that might ring bells for you from your intro psych class or other things you may have read: Phineas Gage and H.M. Phineas Gage was a person who worked in construction in the, I don't know the year off the top of my head. I want to say it was the late 1800s. But he was working, I believe, on I think it was a railroad, and there was an explosion as they were using some dynamite for some excavation, and this long metal rod shot out from where they were doing some of the excavation and went into his eye socket and out the back of his head, and it damaged his frontal lobe considerably. Oh, gosh, you know what? When I say that, actually, as I'm picturing it in my head, I'm getting it kind of wrong. Look up a picture. They're not, too graphic because they didn't have actual photographs of this, I don't think. They're kind of diagrams. I think it actually kind of went up through his cheek and then up near his eye. Sorry for not being very specific on this. I'm kind of mixing it up with another example. But Phineas Gage had all this damage to his frontal lobe. And after this, he, by some reports, started to develop all of these different sort of patterns of behavior. He supposedly was a very good guy, dutiful family member, and all these things beforehand, and then afterwards he kind of lost some of his impulse control, so to speak, and had a change in personality where he was much more short-tempered. He was likely to go out drinking and gambling, and he cheated on his wife and all these things. So that was kind of an early indication to people that studied the brain that the frontal lobe was important for things like personality and impulse control and things like that. More recently, I think people have shed some doubt on how, what a shining example of a person he was to begin with, which is also, kind of hard to prove one way or another, but it's just another example of how case studies are kind of in the eye of the researcher. There's no real data to look at, so if you write something up in these, especially a long time ago, it was sort of hard to confirm these different ideas. But that was one of the more famous examples. Another example is a patient that's referred to as HM. This is a person who had a disorder that caused lots of seizures, and sometimes those can be obviously very, very dangerous to leave untreated. So HM actually had, exhausted lots of different options for treatment and opted to have a couple parts of the brain removed that they thought might help with the seizures. And they happen to be different parts, the parts of his hippocampus in each lobe of the brain, or each hemisphere of the brain, sorry. And this, at the time, in the 1950s, they didn't quite know as much about the brain as we do now, and this was sort of a turning point where it became very clear that memory is very, very much associated with the hippocampus, because after HM had these pieces removed, he ceased to be able to form new memories. Or declarative memories at least. He knew who he was, he knew things about his past, but he could not, then form new memories about, people he would meet. So you've kind of probably seen things like this in different entertainment, like the movie Memento with Guy Pearce. He can't form new memories, and he's trying to solve the murder of his wife. Or 50 First Dates, that Drew Barrymore and Adam Sandler movie, where every day he comes to meet her and tries to get her to fall in love with him. Those are, inspired probably in part by cases like HM, where they can't form new memories. But this also led to psychologists learning tons and tons about how memory works and the differences between conscious and unconscious types of memories. Because even though he couldn't tell you if he'd met a person after the injury 100 times or never, there were things that indicated that he had familiarity with them. So this was one of the early things that showed researchers that implicit memories or unconscious memories are kind of separable, and procedural memories, like things like cooking or riding a bike or things like that, might be a bit different from explicit memories, because it took him, he passed away some time ago, but it took him a long time to learn things, but he could learn how to do things that didn't require explicit memory. So learning new, physical skills, for example, and becoming more comfortable with people, even if he didn't explicitly remember them. So HM, was a patient that ended up, not being able to really care for himself all that well, although he was, a friendly, capable person in general. If you can't remember things, it's going to be difficult to live your life. So he lived in a hospital setting for the rest of his life, but by all accounts was, had some understanding of what had happened to him, that he'd had an injury, and, enjoyed, it seemed, taking part in all of these experiments and lived until he was in his 80s, actually, doing all of these types of studies. So there are lots of research examples like this where some sort of brain injury that we obviously would not be able to replicate. You can't puncture somebody's frontal lobe or remove part of their brain for no reason. But if these things happen by chance or they happen from surgery, then we can use these very specific examples to try to figure out things about how the brain might work. Obviously, we have a lot of different methods now, like fMRI, and different ways to sort of look inside the brain, so to speak. But these are still very useful starting points to figure out, non-experimental, non-cause and effect types of relationships, but to at least take a look at what might happen if you have a decrement in some area of the brain. Other types of case studies that we tend to see are things like forensic psychologists profiling criminals, particularly, this happens with serial killers, that not really popular, but a current and very good Netflix show, Mindhunters, talks about the early days of this in the FBI. Forensic psychology is a very important field. Profiling criminals tends to be a little bit dodgy as far as the science goes. People might not be able to, make predictions about who's likely to commit crimes that much better because of these sorts of efforts, but they still, might have some beneficence. So it is still kind of an open area. All these types of case studies, though, have some things in common, that they are not necessarily just relying on one type of information. They might use interviews, they might use different trials of skills, like HM, for example. Lots of interviews with him about what his life was like, the things he experienced after his injury, before his injury, what he remembered, what he didn't. But those were just part of all the information that he gave, just kind of background. What he contributed a lot more was all the different types of memory tasks that he would engage in. And with the backdrop of his personal history, his intelligence level, his areas of the brain in particular that were lost, doing all the different sorts of memory tasks and intellectual tasks he did afterwards, you could kind of paint a picture of what different parts of the brain are useful for, putting all of those things together. So it wasn't just one thing or another, and frequently you might have a lot more information than that even. You might have other things about people's histories, test results, their school history, things from people that they know, like employers or families, things like their medical history. All these things come together because in a case study, you're really trying to get the most comprehensive picture of a person that you can. One other example I want to mention, just to point out that case studies don't always have to be with individual people, is that sometimes you might see people refer to case studies when they just don't have a comparison. If they're looking at one sort of example of pretty much anything, like a study in the 70s that was trying to look at whether people are convinced or affected by subliminal messaging. So there was a study where they were looking at ads with supposedly subliminal messaging that had to do with arousal, where they were literally, very quickly below the level of consciousness putting words like sex into these gin ads, and they wanted to see if people were aroused after viewing those ads. So this was just one condition of a study, basically, and they found, 2/3 of people were aroused. Okay, well, seems like the ads are working, right? Well, maybe not. Maybe they are maybe other alternative explanations are useful before you come to that conclusion. And hopefully all of you are assuming that already at this point. So it could be things like seeing alcohol in general makes people feel aroused because they're thinking about parties, or they're thinking about different encounters they've had with people, or thinking about stuff they see in movies or whatever. It could be that it has nothing to do with the subliminal messaging at all, and it's just from seeing an advertisement for alcohol or some particular alcohol. A better way to test this, obviously, might be with an experiment. Because you also don't know if this is just kind of the baseline level of arousal people might report on any given day. So, it'd be better to give people two conditions, right? A gin ad with some sort of subliminal arousal content, and a gin ad without that arousal content. And then if you did see around 2/3 of people reporting arousal in the arousal group and much less in the other group, then you would have some evidence the message had an effect. But all this to say that if you are doing case studies for things like this, basically what you're doing is an incomplete experiment where you can't really say all that much about what is causing what. So case studies all told, I know I've spent the biggest proportion of this just like kind of crapping all over them, but they are really useful in a lot of ways because they give you lots of really rich information about people. And think about all the different benefits we've talked about with experiments and surveys, but if you are really trying to boil human behavior down to a number, you're losing a whole lot of the richness of what life and experience and behavior are like, right? So if you're never thinking about human behavior in context, and you're always just thinking about boiling it down into a cell in a spreadsheet, then you're really going to lose sight of how things are really connected. You're going to be thinking about it too dryly or too cynically in some senses. So case studies can really kind of bring you back to reality. They can show you how things might relate, and it can give you inspiration for how to test those things in maybe a more empirical, quantitative way. Maybe more importantly, or just as importantly, it lets us do some kind of studies that we would never ever be able to do if we had to start them, basically. So a brain injury patient that has a severed corpus callosum or a missing hippocampus or a lesion to a particular area of their brain that just happened because of an accident or something, they might be very valuable to tell us something about brain function, but we could never do that to a person on purpose. So trying to get a whole picture of what that person is like and see what decrements developed after that injury might be extremely useful, even though we wouldn't be able to do an experiment like that. But obviously case studies have lots and lots of disadvantages. If you have, we talk in this class about sample sizes a lot, having a sufficient sample size, and usually we're talking about sample sizes in the hundreds as even sometimes being not enough and not having enough power to say that we're able to detect an effect or generalize to a bigger population. Well, think about case studies as having an N, or a sample size, of 1. If you have an N of 1, then you really can't generalize to anything else. It's basically anecdotal evidence, but it's just more structured, rich anecdotal evidence. So you really can't generalize to wider populations. It just kind of gives you a starting point and maybe inspiration for future studies. I've talked too about how, Freud and some researchers maybe had to do with Phineas Gage. They might inject their own expectations into what they're doing, or they might try to make themselves look smarter or more correct than they really are. So researcher bias can creep into these things a little more easily sometimes because it is narrative. It's not quantitative. You don't have numbers to fall back on, so it can be a little misleading sometimes. But I don't want to give anyone the impression, of course, that just because you have numbers, you can't lie with them, right? And that's, again, I know I've mentioned this all the time, but it's going to be the last section of our course will be all about how people might intentionally or not kind of lie even when they have numbers. Disadvantages, further ones, that you can't really replicate these things generally. You can't like get another brain injury patient necessarily, or get another person that has this particular disorder that's willing to work with you. So you can't generally repeat these things. They take forever. Because you have to, go very in depth to get a whole picture of a person. And again, because we're not manipulating anything, we're just kind of observing different things about a person, we can't really come to any sort of causal conclusion. So, very difficult to tell if anything is actually related in a very meaningful way. Okay. I want to spend last little bit of this talking about archival research, which does share some interesting aspects with case studies. Archival research can be a wide variety of things. It's basically anytime you're using pre-existing data to look at a research question, basically. So again, just like with case studies, you have very, very little control over what's going on. You're not manipulating anything. You are just finding existing records and trying to get a hopefully rich picture of what's going on in the world. So you might look at statistical records for this, for example, census records, other maybe local governmental records that are a little more detailed, archives of different surveys and polls going back in history. One exciting source of archival data now is from initiatives we have for open science, and again, we'll talk about more toward the end of the semester, but the way that science is conducted over time and all of the open materials that people are providing provide us a window into how people conduct science. So a field of meta science is kind of emerging now that we all are trying to keep more open records. One really, really interesting I'm trying not to say trend because it's in the word Google trend, but one interesting turn recently is that people have really discovered how our behavioral traces that we leave when we use the internet and any apps or anything like that are a really incredibly rich source of data. And I mean, obviously, some people figured that out before others. Facebook, Google, and Microsoft being the three main victors or culprits or whatever you want to say, depending on your perspective, in figuring that out and leveraging human behavior to make a profit. The researchers are on a trajectory now where we are realizing how important these types of data are. If we want to study behavior as scientists, sometimes it's hard to get natural behavior, but people's internet behavior frequently is very well documented and available for us to look at people's attitudes and behaviors. So just to tell you kind of a brief story about Google data, I first came into contact with it when I was writing a paper that had to do with racialization in the aftermath of Obama being elected. Racial attitudes have always had a big influence on politics, but after Obama was elected, people started thinking about a lot of things, maybe unintentionally, in terms of race. So people, unsurprisingly, were more likely to vote for Obama if they were more racially liberal, and less likely to vote for him if they were racially conservative. That makes sense, right? It's not a good thing or a desirable thing necessarily, but it makes sense that people's racial attitudes would lead them to vote for a black guy or not to be president. But what is maybe less expected is that racialization spilled over into other things, like support for Obama's healthcare plan or his tax plan. Those things don't really have anything to do with race on their face, so people's racial attitudes should not influence those, but they did very heavily. So I was writing a paper about how race influenced people's perceptions of fairness of the 2008 and 2012 elections. It said, essentially, if you were more racist, you thought the 2008 and 12 elections were less fair, and that had never happened before in survey data. And I came across this paper by a researcher. He was, at the time, a graduate student at Harvard. He wasn't in psychology. I want to say he was in like political economy or something like that. But his name is Seth Stevens Davidowitz. He had a paper at the time that was unpublished, but it was going around, and he used a different source to measure racism than anybody ever had before. Usually we use things like racial resentment, these items that people respond to, or stereotype endorsement, or the IAT, where we're having people do reaction times. And these things all, do both, in some senses, really good, and in other senses, really bad jobs of measuring racism. But this guy, Steven Davidowitz, he realized that people will tell Google things that they won't tell their family, their friends, their therapist, their doctor. People just say anything into Google, and it can, in a sense, be kind of a window into what people really think. He now calls it digital truth serum, the things that we're willing to type on the internet. They kind of uncover our real feelings. So he wanted also to look at racialization and how it affected the 2008 and 12 elections. But he didn't want to use survey responses. He wanted to use people's Google searches. So he searched for, or he used Google Trends to see where people in the run-up to 2008 and 2012 were searching more for racist jokes and searching more for racial epithets like the N-word. And he found that these, if he broke this down by the level of zip code, he could predict the vote share in a county for or against Obama with as much accuracy as you could if you used an ideology measure. So obviously, people's ideology or partisanship should predict their vote choice, but it's pretty insane that if you search for the N-word, that is going to predict your vote choice. But it did, because people that were interested in those racial jokes were people that were more racist, presumably. And if you look at that at the zip code or county level, that's going to be a pretty powerful predictor of the amount of racism or the number of racist people in that area. So at the time, nobody really believed that this was a good way to measure racism. He tried to get this paper published at 5 different journals. To my knowledge, the original paper never actually got published, but now thousands of papers since then have used Google Trends to look at people's search history, or not, you don't look at individual people's search histories, but use aggregated search histories to explore, attitudes and behaviors in a way we never had before. And if I can plug it, he has written like a popular science type of book about this stuff called Everybody Lies, where he talks about, people's racial attitudes and how they develop affinities for different sports teams. And he uses a bunch of data from Pornhub to look at people's like sexual preferences. Like, it's a really wide-ranging but very, very interesting book about how we can use people's behavior on the internet to do some really interesting research. So I think this fits in under the rubric of archival research. You're using existing data, the data that Google is willing to part with, of course, but you can get some of this and you can do really interesting things with it. Other types of data that we might use in archival research, maybe a little more obvious, people's old letters, diaries, newspaper articles, professional memos and notes. I know a researcher in the political science department at Tulane, Muriel Holman. If you have a chance to take a class with her, eventually, if you have time, I would recommend it. She's fantastic. But she does a lot of work on local politics, state and city level and county level local politics. And she to do some of this work, she goes to, archives in different cities, frequently New Orleans, but sometimes other ones, and, makes scans of old memoranda from different local government meetings, and does content analysis of those to see how things have changed over time. So it can be really interesting. That's a lot of work, though. More recently, people have started using, again, the internet to do this kind of archival research. That people are posting an incredible amount of stuff online. Twitter, for example, if you want to look at what people are thinking at a particular moment in time, you can program things to just look via Twitter to kind of scrape data from the internet to see how people are talking about things. One project I'm doing right now that has to do with this is I'm working with some people to try to see how being a more extreme or more moderate Democrat or Republican might make you more or less willing to voice your opinions. And I've used some congressional data, like people's vote choices and how many bills they co-sponsor and amend. But I'm also looking at Twitter. So I've got the Twitter account handles of all the people in the 115th Congress, and I have about 600,000 tweets from those about 535 or so people that were in those congressional seats, and I'm using those to see how frequently they communicate with people, how frequently they tweet, and then I want to use some different content analysis tools to look at if they're talking in ways that are consistent with the people in their parties, basically, and if they're more extreme or they're more willing to violate those sorts of language rules that we have. Quickly to mention, I already kind of talked about this as far as written and online records, but, you can use newspapers, magazines, TV programs, all these things to look at, things over time, things in different cultures, targeted at different audiences, and just look back to see how people thought about things at different times. And I mentioned this too when I was talking about Twitter, content analysis and coding. This can be a really, really labor-intensive thing to look through tweets and say, yes, this one is angry, or this one is about coronavirus, or this one is about Obama. It takes a lot of time. So that more and more is being automated through different software and machine learning tools. One of the most common versions of this is by a researcher named Jamie Pennebaker at UT Austin. He and his grad students for a long time have been trying to use the way people talk and use language as a dependent variable in their studies. And they came up with a software called Luke Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count. That is, relatively reasonably priced and widely used to do these sorts of things, but there are lots of free softwares out there too, to be able to, instead of having to read through 1,000 memos, you can kind of run them through Luke, and Luke has these built-in dictionaries with different words, and it will tell you, what percentage of the words in a document were related to competence, or were related to how many different types of pronouns they use and things like that. So there are lots of really interesting things you can do there. Just running a bunch of tweets through Luke can tell you if people are, more self-centered at different parts of the year or something like that. It's just a random thing, but they can tell you lots of really interesting stuff. One example I want to talk about briefly is from somebody I went to grad school with, actually, and I think she has made a really important contribution to our understanding of gender roles and sexism. And she developed a scale to measure something unique about this, and she kind of developed it using an archival approach. So her name is Andrea Miller. She's currently at the University of Illinois teaching and still doing research. But she came up with a way to measure what anthropologists, sociologists, and some psychologists for a long time have called the separate spheres. She measures it with something she calls separate spheres ideology. And what she means by separate spheres is that, gender differences in the world lead men and women to kind of occupy different sectors of the world. some people believe, these are not things that, Andrea believes, or not things that I'm endorsing here. They are the contents of the separate spheres ideology. But if you endorse this ideology, you think gender differences are innate. They're not socially constructed. They're biological. It doesn't matter what situations men and women are in. They're going to act like men if they're men and women if they're women. That people choose these things to some extent. Women don't want to work. Men don't want to be at home. These sorts of things. And the spheres that men and women occupy are not overlapping, but they're, equal in some ways. That's because they're where men want to be and they're where women want to be. So the idea behind this basically being that men belong at work, doing the hard labor or whatever it happens to be, and women belong in the home, making the home run well, taking care of the children, cooking, all of these things. So Andrea wanted to measure this in a really systematic way, and she's shown that it predicts a lot of things like even employment discrimination and people's views about relationships and things like that. Really cool work. You should look it up if you're interested in. She's had some of it published in a journal called PLOS One, PLOS, and the word one. There's an open source journal, so you don't have to pay for those articles or try that hard to find them. But she, to come up with this measure in the first place, she spent a really long time looking at how genders are represented in popular media and in commercials. So she, recorded tons and tons of television and went through it, and her and some research assistants coded all these different ways that genders are represented. And she did this archival analysis of the way that we represent and think about men and women in order to develop this scale. And it ended up being a really successful scale that predicts all these things, predicts how much people work in the home, if there's an imbalance between men and women, how their income is balanced, if people support flexible work policies like maternity leave, and related to a bunch of other relevant sexism measures. But she wouldn't have had a good or as good necessarily of a scale had she not been paying attention to things out in the real world, in the media that we consume. So she used that to create a really interesting scale. So case studies and archival analysis, they are a lot of work. They are labor intensive. They can be very complicated. Are they worth it? And I would say that is something that depends completely on your research question. Sometimes if you want to study a certain type of problem or issue, you're not going to have much of a choice, because if you're trying to study, brain injury patients, you're not going to be able to run experiments. You're going to be running single case studies and doing things like that with individual people. Other times you might be able to do a broader program of research that incorporates lots of other things and eventually includes case studies or starts with case studies, and it might be a complement to some of the other work that you're doing. So it depends on your research question. They are a lot of work, but they might, in some cases, inspire you at the beginning of a research program, or let's say you have a bunch of laboratory experiments that, show something in a very highly controlled setting of a laboratory. Well, it might also be useful to find an example of how the dynamic that you're proposing and have already supported functions out in the real world, in a particular situation or with a particular person. So, if you can find an example where your different dynamic that you're studying really exists with a particular person or setting, then you can provide a sort of corroboration or replication of something you've already been studying, and it can be pretty useful. So one example that comes to mind for me is this idea called moral foundations theory, that there are like 5 different moral foundations, fairness, harm, authority, sanctity, and loyalty. That these are 5 different foundations that we weigh our morality differently. And there's a series of studies showing that liberals and conservatives have kind of different things they weigh. Liberals are more concerned about fairness and harm and care, and conservatives tend to weigh all the things relatively equally. And they did a bunch of survey studies about these, but then they also wanted to show this happens out in the real world. So they found an online resource with thousands of sermons transcribed, and they used a very liberal set of churches, Unitarian churches, and a very conservative set of churches, a certain type of Baptist church, and they compared the content of those sermons using language analysis software to show that the more liberal churches, just like in the surveys from individual people, they had content that was emphasizing fairness and harm at the expense of those other foundations, and conservative churches tended to go in the other direction or weight them more equally. So these people that studied this, the papers by Jesse Graham, Jonathan Haidt, and Brian Nosek, it's a really cool paper, 2009, but it's they made it more convincing by providing a kind of real-life example using archival methods to show that their hypotheses were borne out there. So, again, these things can be worth it. They're very labor-intensive, and they have, limitations that you are hopefully well aware of at this point. So I hope you enjoyed this maybe slightly different lecture with lots of random Freudian sex things at the beginning and then a bunch of specificities about the internet towards the end. But anyway, at least I mixed it up a little bit at this point. All right. I'm going to end now, and you'll hear me again when we talk about quasi-experiments. Thanks.